Hi, I'm Fred Abbott. I'm a professor of law at Florida State University College of Law. I've been teaching international trade law for about 30 years. I was rapporteur for the Committee on International Trade Law of the International Law Association for about 20 years. I served on the editorial board of Oxford's Journal of International Economic Law for about 25 years. I've written widely in the field of international trade and related subjects such as international intellectual property. I've represented governments in World Trade Organization dispute settlement proceedings. And I thought today that in light of President Trump's February 13, 2025 announcement of a directive to his heads of agency dealing with international trade, directing them to study the potential imposition of reciprocal tariffs on trading partners of the United States, that I might discuss with you what these reciprocal tariffs may be, what this means, and how they fit within the international trading system. So, to begin with, tariffs are duties or levies imposed on goods as they cross a border and are imported into a country and before they enter into the stream of commerce. The most common form of tariff is something called an ad valorem tariff, where you take the declared value of the goods to be imported, you take the percentage of the tariff, so let's call it 3%. If it's on goods worth $100, a 3% tariff would then result in a $3 tariff. That's the most common form. You can also have tariffs on quantities or volumes of products. There's something called a tariff rate quota, which is a tariff that goes up as the total volume of goods imported into the country rises. But basically, the most common form of tariff is the ad valorem tariff, which I expect is what most people are familiar with. Now, reciprocal tariffs are not a term used in international trade to refer to a type of tariff. But I think in the context of what the Trump administration is talking about, we know what they mean by reciprocal tariffs. And they're based on the concept of reciprocity. And reciprocity is a concept that is embedded in the international trading system. It's a feature of the WTO and formerly GATT system. And the basic idea is that in terms of trade negotiation and agreement on the final outcomes, that countries should not expect to get something for nothing, that at the end of the negotiations, there should be a balance between the concessions granted by each country in the round of trade negotiations. And these, in the modern era, tariff negotiations have been conducted in something referred to as rounds, which basically means that a group of countries get together and each country puts forward its proposal for tariffs, and the countries negotiate with each other and ultimately try to reach a consensus among a large group about what their tariffs, individual tariffs, will be. When those tariffs are finally agreed in the WTO system, they are bound. They're bound and they're entered into a schedule of concessions. And a country, in principle, may not charge tariffs higher than its bound tariff rates in the WTO schedule of concessions. And it may charge lower rates. Those would then be called applied tariffs. But it has to apply the same tariff to all countries in the system, that is so-called MFN tariffs. There's some exceptions for regional arrangements and so forth. But in any case, tariffs are generally bound. And so, at least in the WTO system, in principle, a country can't unilaterally decide that it's going to raise tariffs without being non-compliant with the rules. But it's no secret that the WTO has lost a bit of its status as an international trade forum in recent years, and the United States, in any case, has not been in paying a terribly great amount of attention to whether or not its rules are in compliance with the WTO rules. Now, there's one substantial qualification to this general idea of reciprocity, and that is embedded in the WTO system is that developing countries are not expected to provide the same level of tariff concessions and trade negotiations as developed countries. And there's even further special exemptions for least developed countries, but we won't bother about that at the moment because from an economic standpoint, they are not terribly significant. So in that way, that explains how you can end up with a substantial differential between the tariff rates that countries are charging, why a country like India may be committed to a much higher level of bound tariffs than the United States. And that is because of this special position of developing countries. Now, there's been a great deal of controversy between the United States and China because within the WTO system, countries are allowed to self-designate whether or not they are developing countries. And China has insisted that it remains a developing country. The United States disagrees, does not think it should be given that treatment. And so that's a continuing source of tension between the two countries. Now, in addition to tariffs, which we're all familiar with, which are imposed at the border, which may be a port or an airport, countries also have internal rules and regulations that are applied to goods. And in principle, they're applied to both foreign and domestic goods on an equal basis. That's called the national treatment principle. But so there are many types of regulations or rules that can be applied to goods. For example, with agricultural products, you have sanitary and phytosanitary regulations. With electronic goods, you have technical regulations. You have internal types of measures referred to as subsidies. You have internal taxation. But there are various things that are imposed within the country. And so countries do commit, and whether it's in the WTO agreement or in other trade agreements like regional trading agreements, to treat imported products on the same basis as they treat domestically produced products. But sometimes they don't. And when they don't, the rules that they are, let's say, misapplying are referred to as non-tariff barriers or NTBs. And so the Trump directive refers not only to tariffs, which are these mathematically quantified amounts, but also to non-tariff barriers. So you could have a rule that says imported beef must be labeled in a certain way to identify its origin and whether or not it was, raised without growth hormones or so forth. And those would be sanitary and phytosanitary regulations. And the Trump administration says in terms of computing reciprocal tariffs, we're not only going to take into account the country's tariff rates, but we're also going to consider the level of non-tariff barriers. Now, in principle, this is something that can be done. It's been done in certain areas in terms of trying to quantify what the impact of a regulation is, but it is a challenge because you have to understand what a country's internal regulatory system is, and you have to both understand and then predict or accurately extrapolate what the economic effect of that is on the importer. And this can be challenging because you have to look at supply and demand, and you have to look at how prices vary and so forth. And so, but it's not something that can't be done. It's just something that can be done with a challenge. Now, while I say that, while countries bargain for a reciprocal outcome in terms of trade negotiations, this doesn't mean that two countries who believe they've reached a balance have agreed to impose the same tariffs on the same goods, right? You may well impose different tariffs than a country you're doing business with on different goods, but the idea is that when you've calculated the overall package of goods, that your trading system should ultimately be treated in an equivalent way as another country. And but when you talk about things like, so when the Trump administration says, well, Europe has high tariffs on things that we don't like, um, we do need to bear in mind that those tariffs were the subject of a negotiation with the United States, whether it was in the late 1980s or mid 1990s in the so-called Uruguay round, or whether it was later. It was a part of a package. And so one question is, right, are you going to be revaluing the whole packages, or are you going to be looking at goods on a line by line basis and then say, what you're charging us on X, we are also going to charge you on X, or whether X and Y may have disparate treatment, but the treatment in terms of trade volumes and so forth should balance out. So that's one question that need to be addressed. To the extent that the United States is now saying that it wants to engage in reciprocal trade negotiations with developing countries, and perhaps even least developed countries, who have previously gotten this special beneficial treatment at the WTO and in other trade agreements, and with some special rules and programs otherwise. There's really no reason that the United States can't change its overall trade policy and say, we've decided that we no longer want to pursue that. The idea that there was initially that developing countries, say in India or in Argentina or Brazil, would get special treatment was to try to create a more equal kind of international economic system. But if that's not an objective of the United States, this is a policy choice that the United States can make. Again, it may not be strictly in compliance with WTO rules in the way that it's going about it, but it's not necessarily such an unusual move that the United States says it wants to change its approach to international trade governance. But that's how these imbalances may have arisen, and why the idea of reciprocal tariffs and these reciprocity negotiations may be a bit controversial from that standpoint. Now, China is a special case. We could discuss, and of course it has been discussed at length, what the economic parameters within China are that would lead it to be calling itself a developing country, why the United States objects to that, and so forth. But whatever the resolution of an academic discussion along those lines would be, it seems pretty clear that because of China's, we'll call it exceptional status as a manufacturing center and as a trader, that it's going to be entering into a separate negotiation with the United States that differs from the negotiations that the United States is carrying on with other countries. The United States and China have been bilaterally negotiating going back to the early 1980s. There's nothing new about bilateral or special arrangements between the United States and China. And as you will no doubt recall, during the first Trump administration, we reached a special agreement with China about various of their policies and practices, which we regarded as harmful to international trade. And again, the current Trump administration believes that China may not have been in compliance with a number of commitments it made in that agreement, particularly the agreement to purchase some large amounts of agricultural products, which apparently it has not fulfilled. So hopefully this has provided a bit of hopefully comprehensible background about what we mean by reciprocal tariffs. Again, reciprocal tariff is not a type of tariff. It's referring to this idea of reciprocity, that if we charge you 5% on the importation of apples, you will charge us 5% for American goods on your importation of apples. And in principle, you could go through a line-by-line basis and simply say we have to equalize or normalize our tariff rates. I'm not sure that the Trump administration knows yet what type of approach it will apply, whether it will be looking at an overall package. And again, you have this complex feature that we're not only going to be looking at set numerical figures with respect to particular products, but we're also going to be trying to calculate the value of the internal rules and regulations that are being imposed on the US goods. So you'll take a tariff rate plus another increment, or a straight tariff rate and another increment based on whatever we decide is the economic cost of the internal rule or regulation. The data on tariffs is generally compiled, and you have data sets maintained by the WTO. The US, of course, has a compendium of tariff rates, but it's generally focusing on what the US tariff rates are. But to the extent that we may be missing information about tariff rates in other countries, which certainly our businesses are generally familiar with, but also we can use our US embassies and commercial attaches overseas to help collect data to the extent that is necessary, if it can't, so to speak, simply be scraped from the internet and the data sources used by the relevant countries. So I hope you get some benefit out of that, and I will look forward to providing more kind of introductory guidance on trade rules in the future.